Hi, everyone. Welcome to this talk on the online geography of hate. My name is Gabriel Lariviere, and I'm a research advisor at the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence. So the objective of today's presentation is to highlight some distinct features of the internet as a space where hate acts take place. And we will do so by focusing on four themes. First one being the internet as a space and hateful motives. Second, the internet as a space and the number of perpetrators of hate acts, which will be followed by the internet and the number of victims of hate acts. And finally, we'll have a look at the internet and the degree of seriousness of hate acts. This talk is based on a study that the center conducted. It's based on a survey of 1,843 residents of Quebec in 2017, and the survey was conducted online. One goal of the survey was to gather information about hate incidents and hate crimes being those hate acts that have a criminal component. So we try to better understand these two phenomena. And this allowed us to gather a database of around 360 hate acts as described by victims, but also witnesses. And this was maybe one methodological choice he made that makes the study stand apart slightly from other studies of hate crimes or hate acts, in that we relied on the perspective of witnesses as well as the perspective of victims. In part in order to have a larger sample and a better set of information about hate acts. So first of all, let's look at the different locations that were reported for the hate acts in our sample. So we identified 5 types of locations for in our survey. First of all, commute, which includes public transit, as well as the streets, so individuals walking from one location to another. Second, we have online, the category of interest for today. Then public, which includes public spaces, both indoor and outdoor. So you can think of parks, but also restaurants, bar, or other venues. Then we have the category occupation, which includes both workspaces, but also educational settings, so universities, high schools, or CEGEPs. And our last category was at home, which was the smallest of all 5 categories. And around 8 to 9% of the locations that we recorded were other than the 5 that we have here. So we're going to set them aside for today. So what were the motivations for the hate acts that we have in our sample? So in order to identify motivations, we departed again from some studies in 2 ways. First, we used a more inclusive definition of hate acts. So we allowed participants to identify hateful motives that are typically not included in traditional definitions of hate acts or hate crimes. And second, we allowed participants to choose or identify more than one hateful motive for each hate act that they identified. This allowed us for a better and richer understanding of hate acts and more dynamic in some sense, because we could look at the intersections of different motives. And the results are as follow. Here you have the number of times that a given motive was identified by a participant in our study. So the numbers, as you can see, add up to more than 360, which is because, again, they could identify more than one motive per hate act. So let me go through the different motives. We have ethnicity, religion, skin color, sexual orientation, appearance, social class, gender, political beliefs, disability, other, and age. As you can see, there were a lot of variations between the different types of motives. So some were identified quite often, such as ethnicity and religion, and others like age and disability were not chosen or were not reported by participants in our study as often. So now let's look at the relation between these two variables, between location and the motives. And one way to visualize that relation is by building a graph such as this one here, where we have on the horizontal axis the different motives that we just mentioned. And on the vertical axis, we have the proportion that corresponds to different types of location for each motive. So this tells us, for example, that if you take the motive of religion, that 39% of hate acts that we have in our sample were for which participants identify that they had a religion component, 39% of them took place online, 18% in a public space, 25% on a commute, 10% at work or at school, and 7% at home. So as you can see, there are a lot of variations across motives here. We're not going to go through all of these differences. I want to draw your attention to the lower part of this graph, which includes the location type of interest today, namely online. So in this location type, you can see again a lot of variation. So certain motives like political beliefs took place at a significant proportion online, whereas for other motives such as age, then only a small proportion of the hate acts identified with this motive took place online. So this graph is very useful to see the variations, but doesn't allow us to measure precisely if these differences are statistically significant. So to do so, we built logistic regressions for each motive to see if the probability that a given hate act would exhibit a given motive was sensitive to where it occurred. So was sensitive to the different location types. I'm not going to go through the details of all these regressions because it would take too long, but let me just briefly summarize these results. So there were two kinds of results. First, we found out that some motives were associated with some locations, but other motives really were not sensitive at all to location type. So for example, the social class motive was not associated with locations in any meaningful way. On the other hand, the motive of political beliefs was associated with some locations, and as you can tell from the graph, it was associated with the location of online. Namely, that if a hate act occurred online, then it was more likely that that hate act had a political component. The second kind of result we found were that some location types were associated with some motives, whereas other location types were not. So if we take, for example, the location of public, this location didn't seem to favor any motive. On the other hand, one location clearly stood out from the others, and that's the location of online, which clearly favored a specific set of motives. And let me go through the motives that were favored by the category online. So here we have the motives that were associated with the category type, the location type online. We have gender, religion, ethnicity, politics, political views, and skin color. One way to express the relation that we observe is to measure the number of times the location of online, the number of times it multiplied the odds of a given hate act exhibiting a given motive. So if we take the motive of gender here, if a hate act took place online, then the odds that that hate act would have a gender component were multiplied by 8.38. Similarly for religion, if a hate act occurred online, then it multiplied the odds by 4.5 that that hate act would have a religion component. Same thing for ethnicity, political views, and skin color. So this result was very striking. It clearly set apart online or the internet as a location from other types of location, because it favored these specific 5 kinds of motives, whereas we didn't find similar relations for other location types. Now let's move on to the second and third parts of this presentation, the relation between the internet as a space and the number of victims and perpetrators of hate acts. So here we have a representation of our data, where on the horizontal axis you have, again, the 5 different location types. And on the vertical axis, you have the number of perpetrators. That goes from 1 to 5 or more. So each little blue dot here corresponds to 1 hate act in our sample. And so what this graph shows is the distribution of the number of perpetrators per hate act for each location type. As you can see, the location types of commute, home, occupation, and public tend to have similar distributions. Namely, most hate act that occurred in these locations had, in general, 1 or 2 perpetrators. However, for the location type of online, and the vast majority of hate acts that were recorded and reported in our sample online involved 5 or more perpetrators. And this distinction is very striking visually, and it sets apart, again, the location type of online compared to the other ones. To make sure that the visual representation corresponds to a real, significant statistical relation, we conducted non-parametric tests, since the distribution of the number of perpetrator per location is not normal. It's concentrated around 1 or 2 and not 3, 4 or 2. It's not concentrated in the middle. And so we used a Kruskal-Wallis test, which proved conclusive, namely that there really is a difference between online and the other locations in terms of distribution of number of perpetrators. And then we, just to make sure that that difference came from specifically the high number of perpetrators for the category online, we did a Conover-Iman test, which again confirmed what we see here on the graph. So how do we interpret this difference? One way to interpret it is to try to imagine or to think about what participants in our study were describing when they were describing a hate incident or a hate crime that occurred online. What they were describing was probably not a single post or a single comment by a single user on a social media platform or in a forum or in a comment section. What they were describing were rather the accumulation of several comments made by several users on a single platform at a given time. So really the hate act that they were describing, that we see in our sample, is an accumulation of multiple users targeting an individual on the basis of that individual's identity. This is what we're seeing here, and that would explain why the vast majority of hate acts online involve 5 or more perpetrators. We did the same thing for victims on a scale of 1 to 3 or more. And here again, the difference is very striking. The distributions for commute and home are quite similar, whereas the distribution for public is concentrated at the 2 extremities, so 1 and 3 or more. But again, the location type of online really stands out, as most hate acts online targeted 3 or more individuals. Again, we conducted the same test, the Kruskal-Wallis and Conover tests, in order to ensure that what we're seeing really corresponds to a difference, a statistically significant difference. And the results were, yes, difference here are too strong to be explained by sheer luck or randomness. So there are some dynamics in the different locations that interact with the number of victims, which explain this variation that we observe here. How do we interpret this again? Why is it that hate acts online tend to target in our sample, but also possibly in a population, more than 3 or more individual in most cases. One way to make to explain this is to look at what perhaps the participants in our study had in mind. And they, given that, as we saw, what they were describing was probably the accumulation of several users making several comments, then what they're describing was probably also these users using denigrating language or making threats, targeting not one individual, but entire communities to which that individual belongs, perhaps. So the dynamic online perhaps is slightly different from from the dynamics in other locations, where it really is something about hate online, which favors expressing hate, targeting entire communities. And this is what we see here in this graph. Now, the last part of our presentation, are hate acts online more serious? So we asked participants in our study to describe the degree of seriousness of hate acts on a scale of 1 to 4, from benign to very serious. And then we disaggregated the data based on location types. And as you can see, there are again variations. If you focus on the column to the right, the pink one, that corresponds to the category online. It's one of the lowest for the benign category. But then if you move along the spectrum of seriousness towards very serious, it tends to be the highest. And the difference between the location type of online and the other locations also grows, meaning visually that this suggests that hate acts occurring online tend to be more serious. And we did verify that result by doing a proportional ordinal regression, which suggested that hate acts occurring online the fact that a hate act occurs online multiplies by 2.2 the odds of that hate act being more serious. One way to interpret this result is to think of suppose you have a hate act that occurs in a park. Someone threatens another individual on the basis of religion affiliation. Suppose that hate act, that threat in the park, was perceived to be serious. Then if we were to have a similar hate act, that hate act occurred online, then the odds of that hate act to be not serious, but very serious will be multiplied by 2.2, meaning, generally speaking, hate acts online are more serious. And this was a surprising result for us, in part because hate acts online lack that physical component, the possibility of physical harm. And so it was surprising to us that hate acts online were, generally speaking, perceived as being more serious. So we try to explain why that is the case. And one hypothesis is that perhaps hate acts online are proportionally more likely to include hate crimes and not hate incidents. And perhaps hate crimes are perceived to be more serious. So we verified that hypothesis, and it turns out that it is not true. So it is the case that hate crimes in general are more serious. They multiply the odds of being more serious by 2.6. However, as you can see in this graph, once you look at the distribution of type of hate acts per location, the distribution is roughly the same. Hate acts online, 22% of them are hate crimes, and that proportion is not doesn't differ in any significant way from the proportion of hate crimes in other location types. So perhaps another reason why we see this difference is that hate acts online are more serious because they involve more perpetrators and they target more victims, as we saw. And there is some truth to that explanation. So we measured here the effect of having higher numbers of victims and higher numbers of perpetrators on the odds of being more serious. And the lines here represent this result. So as you move upward on the scales of number of victims and number of perpetrators, as you see here, the odds of a hate act being more serious also increase. So if we take the orange line here, for example, the number of perpetrators, take again our example of a hate act occurring in a park, someone threatening another individual on the basis of religion, then suppose that that hate act is judged to be serious. And if we add another perpetrator, then the odds are multiplied by roughly 1.25. And if we move up to all the way up to 5 or more perpetrators, then the odds of that act being not serious, very serious, are multiplied by 2.5. So this positive relation between the numbers of victims and perpetrators and the degree of seriousness is something that could explain in part why hate acts online are more serious, because they target more people and because they involve more perpetrators. So this concludes our presentation for today. So we saw 4 ways in which the internet is a distinct environment for hate, namely that it favors specific motives. It also favors greater numbers of perpetrators and victims. And in general, hate acts online tend to be perceived as being more serious. More information about hate acts on the basis of that study can be found in our new report, which you can find on our website. And I thank you all for listening to this presentation, and be happy to hear from you if you have any comments or questions. Thank you very much. Have a good day.